So I'm on a little bit of an X-Men kick right now, so why not bring it back to the original? X-Men. Now, the original X-Men movie came out over 20 years ago now and was directed by Bryan Singer, and this was one of the first big blockbuster superhero movies. Now, there was always a market for superhero movies. You had your Supermans and Batmans, and at this point you even had Blade, but this was still the very early days of Marvel movies being a thing. Blade was the first Marvel movie to have huge success, and that definitely has a lot of influence on this movie, especially the costuming. Blade had a lot of that black leather outfit going on with sunglasses. This movie definitely takes some of that inspiration when trying to adapt the X-Men, which admittedly have some pretty goofy costumes if you just take it at face value, and grounded in a world that's sci-fi but still very practical and could happen in the not too distant future. And that's something that I appreciate about this movie, even though it is very much set in the late 90s, early 2000s, just based on special effects, costuming, all the things that just date a movie, and the fact that Magneto was a kid in the 40s in this flashback, and he's still alive in the present day, so it can't be that much further in the future. But what this movie does really well is give it that sci-fi kind of Black Mirror tone that I feel like was the appropriate tone to go with back in the day when they were still filling out the X-Men. What are the X-Men? Well, they're an allegory for racism, prejudice, whatever kind of bigotry or hatred that a certain group of people face at any given time. That's why the X-Men have endured for so long, because it can mean whatever. In the 60s, it was an allegory for racism and the civil rights movement, but, you know, times have changed, causes have changed. You can really put whatever you want onto the X-Men, and it works just as well. And so that's what makes the X-Men so relatable. They're the eternal underdog. They're the marginalized group that will never be accepted by society. So by giving this movie a more sci-fi Black Mirror, this is like our world but a little different allegorical spin, it works really well, because that's really what this first X-Men movie is all about. It's all about prejudice. It's about mutant hatred, the Registration Act being proposed by Senator Kelly, and what are the X-Men to do? What are the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants to do? Because the Brotherhood is probably one of the more interesting things about this movie, not only because they're super memorable, and I definitely watched this movie a lot as a kid, and I remember every single one of them. Of course, Magneto, played by Ian McKellen, steals the show, but you also have Mystique, his right-hand lady, who can shapeshift into anybody. You have Sabretooth, who's just a big walking grizzly bear. And then you have Toad, who always was my favorite. I always loved Toad. He just got such a cool look and power set that it's so disgusting, but at the same time, it's Ray Park, Darth Maul from The Phantom Menace from Star Wars. He's Toad in this movie, and he just brings such a great amount of athleticism and dexterity to this role, and he just does such a great job. But basically, Magneto and all the other mutants aren't too happy about this whole mutant registration thing, so he gets the big idea of, what if we just turned all the humans into mutants? By using this machine, we're going to put it at the top of the Statue of Liberty, and we're going to turn all the world leaders on Ellis Island at this summit into mutants, and then our cause will be theirs. They'll be one of us, and they'll have more sympathy for the mutants. And as far as evil plans go, that's not that evil a plan. Granted that they don't die from this radiation and mutation that is forced upon them. Oh yeah, that does kind of happen, because you have Senator Kelly, who gets kidnapped and then experimented on as a test to see if this machine works, and it does. It turns him into a jellyfish man. He gets these like jellyfish powers that are a little vague. He just is a little stretchy, and he's got gills when he comes up out of the water, so I guess he's a fish of some kind. But very quickly his body rejects this mutation, and he just melts. He just turns into a puddle of water. Which, again, going into the more sci-fi aspects of this movie, there's quite a bit of body horror in this movie, and this original X-Men trilogy in general. There are a lot of moments of pretty dark imagery involving body mutilation, experimentation, and just the death of various mutants. And Senator Kelly is one of them that I watched as a kid. I was like, oh, that's kind of intense. It actually kind of reminded me of John Carpenter's The Thing, and how all the body mutilations that happen with that. Now, granted, this is all CGI, and it's not nearly as bloody as The Thing, but I don't know, there's something about that operating table that just gives me the same vibe. But the big question is, what are the X-Men gonna do about that? And to that I say, well, who are the X-Men? Because this is the first X-Men movie. A lot of audiences, they don't know the X-Men comics. Sure, it was a big deal in the 70s with Chris Claremont and going through the 80s. But really, aside from the 90s cartoon show, which was a big hit with kids, a lot of audiences just weren't that connected. So this movie had to introduce the X-Men in a big way, and they start off by putting us through the perspective of Rogue, played by Anna Paquin, doing her best at a southern accent, which admittedly isn't that great, but she does it okay if you don't pay too close attention. And she's, your average girl from Mississippi, and she kisses her boyfriend one day, and then he goes into a coma. Kind of a traumatic experience. She starts freaking out. She doesn't know what happened. All she knows is that if he touches her, it just sucks the life out. And again, going into the body horror, we actually see the veins popping out, and it gets kind of graphic the way that she can suck the life out of people. And so she hits the road. She adopts the moniker of Rogue. She goes all the way up to Canada, and she meets Wolverine. And here we get our big introduction to the Wolverine. And if you don't know this scene, this opening scene with Wolverine in the cage fight has to be my favorite scene in an X-Men movie. Period. Actually, I take that back. Nightcrawler's introduction in X-Men 2 has to be my favorite. This is a very close second because the way they introduce Wolverine is just perfect. This is Hugh Jackman, Wolverine, first appearance. Nobody really knew how Hugh Jackman was going to fit into the role of Wolverine. He's a 6-foot Broadway singer. He hadn't really done a lot of action movies up until this point, so having him as Wolverine was a bit of a risk. But here, the way they shoot him, the way they keep his face obscured, the way you see the hair, the smoke, the cigar, the clang of metal on his knuckles, it just sells it 100%. And also, Hugh Jackman just has that Wolverine snarl down to a science. And yeah, after that scene, and on top of that, the first scene where you see him pop out his claws at that dude's neck, and you see the tissue split in between his knuckles. Again, a little bit more of that sci-fi body horror coming into effect. There was no doubt in anybody's mind that Hugh Jackman was the perfect person to cast as Wolverine. And so now Rogue, seeing that she's not the only mutant up here in Canada, she hitches a ride with Wolverine. And then the X-Men show up, Storm and Cyclops. And so now we see some more X-Men doing their X-Men thing. And you see Cyclops use his visor, you see Storm control the snow. And while it's not the grandest display of power the X-Men have ever shown, it is a neat little introduction. And now we're at the X Mansion, where we're introduced to even more of our X-Men. Realize that the mansion is a school for gifted youngsters, and it's really just a safe haven for mutants to develop their powers, to learn education, to be reintroduced into society. It's actually a very productive establishment. All the X-Men are really school teachers. Cyclops, Storm, Jean Grey, Professor X, that's our core team. And the casting here is also really good. You have James Marsden as Cyclops, who admittedly is a little dull, but that's just Cyclops, so I guess that's good casting. You have Halle Berry as Storm, which, alright, that fits. Just please ease off of the fake African accent going forward, because here it is a little distracting. And you have Femke Jensen as Jean Grey, and she's fine. But the real standout as far as casting, aside from Logan, played by Hugh Jackman, is Professor X, played by Patrick Stewart. And this was just a match made in heaven, man. You watch Star Trek Next Generation, and you see him, and you're like, yes, bald British dude, very stoic, very in charge, but also very sympathetic and very relatable. So, yes, there it is, Professor X. But now that all the X-Men are introduced, you really start to get a better understanding of Magneto's plan, because not only does this machine turn humans into mutants, it also really drains Magneto's power, and it almost killed him when he tested it on Senator Kelly. So in order to not have that happen again, he's going to transfer his power to Rogue, and then Rogue's going to go up in that machine and probably die in the process, because, well, sometimes the pawns need to be sacrificed for the greater good, according to Magneto. And so through Mystique infiltrating the X-Mansion and playing off of Rogue's insecurities, Rogue runs off, gets kidnapped by Magneto, and then gets put up in the Statue of Liberty for our big third act showdown. You have all the X-Men in their black X-Men suits, which have gotten a lot of grief over the years, but again, this was the early 2000s, and I don't think audiences were ready for Wolverine to be donning his comic accurate yellow spandex with the mask and the cowl and all that. It was a different time back then. They had just accepted Blade as a viable franchise, so now baby steps. And I do have to give this movie props for actually being an original X-Men story, because all the other X-Men movies have borrowed something or another, some kind of key plot point from another X-Men story. X2 was just basically an adaptation of God Loves, Man Kills. X-Men 3 was kind of a combination between the Cure storyline and the Dark Phoenix saga. You have X-Men First Class, which takes a lot from the Hellfire Club, which was also from the Phoenix saga. Dark Phoenix was also the Dark Phoenix saga. X-Men Days of Future Past was Days of Future Past. Apocalypse was Apocalypse. They're always borrowing stuff from the comics, but this one, I don't know of a single X-Men comic that has Magneto infiltrate the Statue of Liberty to try to turn everybody into mutants. I don't think that exists. If it does, let me know in the comments and I'll retract my statement, but as of right now, I'm pretty sure this is a completely original X-Men story, which is really impressive. Not only that it's original, that they didn't just borrow something from the comics, but that it actually works as a movie. This is a really good construction to introduce us to the X-Men, to introduce us to the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, and to give us a real threat, a ticking clock that has to do with mutant-human relations, the prejudices that the mutants feel from the humans, and a plan by Magneto that actually falls in line with his mutant superiority mindset. And because of that, this movie holds up a lot better than many other one-off Marvel comic book adaptations of the time. You think about this era of comic book movies, and they were throwing a lot of different superheroes at the wall to see what stuck. We had Ghost Rider, we had Daredevil, we had the Fantastic Four, we had Ang Lee's Hulk. They were trying everything just to see what superheroes connected with general audiences. But I think the X-Men connected for two main reasons. For one, it's the prejudice allegory. That's always going to be relevant. That's always going to connect with people. And two, the sheer number of superpowers on display in this movie is really impressive. And the fact that they got really creative with the special effects to pull it off. Because aside from Mystique, and I'd say Mystique's shape-changing powers, which utilize a lot of early CGI, doesn't really hold up as well. They're pretty inconsistent, but most of this movie uses a lot of practical effects. Wolverine's claws, for the most part, are practical. The first time Wolverine uses his claws and you see the flesh split open and a claw come out, that's a practical effect. They actually built a fake Wolverine fist to push out the claw. And the way it's edited, you wouldn't even tell. You would swear that that actually came out of his fist. And there's a lot of hidden practical effects in this movie like that. A lot of this movie was done on set, in camera, and they only really use CGI for the stuff like Mystique, like Toad's tongue, like Cyclops' beam, for the stuff that you really can't do in camera. Those really do require some CGI, but they really did their best to try to do the most that they could in camera, and I appreciate that. But when all our main characters are on Liberty Island and they're showing down with the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, it's really cool. You have a lot of good action. Every character has their own little moment to shine, which does a really good job at making it feel more like a team movie, not just Wolverine and his entourage. Storm gets a lot of cool moments. Jean Grey even gets a lot of good moments of manipulating the different characters. Cyclops even gets to use his visor a few different times. Early Wolverine does steal the show because he has a great fight with Mystique in a hallway where it's all red lit, and the choreography is just fantastic in that sequence. And then he has another pretty brief but also pretty cool showdown with Sabretooth at the top of the Statue of Liberty, and that looks really cool. The only issue is that with Wolverine and Sabretooth in the comics and in the cartoons, there's just such a sense of history between the two. They have such a rivalry. They're both from Canada. They were both part of the Weapon X program. That just really doesn't come across in this movie. Sabretooth only has maybe half a dozen lines in total in this whole movie. He mostly just growls and roars. And Wolverine is much more developed, but their shared history just isn't there. They don't really recognize each other. They don't mention anything about their past, which is a bit of a shame. I just would have liked to see them keep continuity with the comics a little bit more. And as you might expect, Magneto's plans get thwarted. They destroy the machine. Magneto gets arrested. He gets locked up in this really creative plastic prison that I don't remember being a part of the comics, but that has to be. Someone please point me to an X-Men comic where they locked Magneto up in a plastic prison, because that is too creative and too original for Hollywood to come up with. And if they did come up with that on their own, that's such a great idea. And the movie closes with Magneto and Charles Xavier playing glass chess with each other and talking about the fate of the universe. And it's just such a great wrap up to this movie. It's a great moment to end on. Charles is always the optimist and Magneto is more of the realist. He knows that human society will never accept mutants, but Charles really does believe that someday they will realize the error of their ways and they will be accepted. And that's really where the movie ends. It ends on a bit of a triumphant note because Magneto got locked up, but at the same time, it is still ambiguous because the greater threat the Mutant Registration Act and humans' hatred of mutants is still very much at large. And that's X-Men, the first X-Men, the X-Men movie that started it all. And it's actually pretty good. This is a good X-Men story. Not only is it exciting and has really stellar casting, but more importantly, it's a fantastic introduction to the world of the X-Men. You get a pretty concise exposition dump when they get to the X-Mansion. You know what they're all about. You know who all the X-Men are. You know all their different powers. You know how they relate to the humans. You know the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. You know about Magneto. All wrapped up in a very digestible package that is this first X-Men movie. And I honestly can't praise it enough. Sure, there's some shortcomings. Some of the effects aren't that great. Sometimes I wish they had followed a little closer to the comics. But all in all, it's a fun time. Now I turn it over to you guys. What do you think about X-Men, the first one? Whatever you think, let me know in the comments. And if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more content and hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. And as always, I'm Colby. This is my nerdy talk, and I'll see you in the next video.